So with this movie, what was the part that started it all? Was it John's journey or just the idea to make a movie about a guy who wears a mask over his head?
Well, so the film's journey started a bit before I got involved. I mean, I've been involved for about 3 years before we shot it, but it existed in a slightly different form before that, through John Ronson and Peter Strawn, the writers. John Ronson, people would know from The Daily Show, and he wrote The Men Who Stare at Goats, the book, and when that book was being turned into a film, adapted by this great screenwriter, Peter Strawn, John and Peter met on the shoot, and they were talking about the fact that John in the 80s was in a band with a character called Frank Sidebottom, who was like a sort of English comedy legend, like the alter ego of a man called Chris Seavey, brilliant, creative, maverick guy. And his shtick was to wear this different, but some way, also a big round head, and sing songs. But they were sort of very naive songs, and so Frank lived on kids' TV as well as on adult comedy, and he gigged and formed this big following, particularly in the north of England. And Peter and John were talking about this and about well, what would it be like if this wasn't somebody's kind of character, but if this was a real person, if there was a musician who for whatever reason, and we never really find out in the film why he wears it. We tease that question out a bit, but what would it be like if somebody was so, freaked out, agoraphobic, or for whatever reason, very earnestly and not as a kind of performance art piece, wore a head.
How do you manage to connect to that as someone who has to direct an actor to play that?
Well, I mean, this was obviously a big question for me, and I always freak out about funny. I'm aware of my pattern now. I usually freak out about a month and a half before I make any film, and I say to anybody who listen to me, this is a terrible mistake. This is the end of my career. I always feel it. Now I don't. Somehow I kind of know that I'm not so prone to taking it seriously, but occasionally would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, thinking, "Oh my God, what happens if we're sitting in the edit a week in and we're just going, well, the head doesn't work. What are we going to do?" I think my sense of it was that the head is like it's not a blank mask. Remember, I watched a couple of films with masks, and there's one he's like a superhero or something like that, but he wears this kind of golden or sort of brass flat like Venetian mask, and it's just terrible. The frame just collapses every time because he's just dead, when you see. But Frank has this kind of round, almost cartoon head that turns him into, I think, like a really expressive puppet-like thing in the middle of the film. That was my kind of hope, and I think it's borne out by the film that, in a strange way, you forget about the head and you really start to feel the character. That's a lot down to Michael. It's a lot down to how good an actor he is, that he can find very subtle, ways of using his body and his voice to do, in a strange way, do more with that character than you would if you really just had him right in front of you.
That's part of the fun of the film and why it's so engaging, is because you like this character and you can't see how he feels about certain things, so you catch yourself trying to figure out, just like John does.
That's right. I mean, John says at one point, what goes on inside that head, So you've got like two layers of distance from him. And I think the fun with that as well is the film is riffing on all sorts of like bad theories of creativity, And John is desperate to know, what is Frank's secret? How does he make this great music? And somehow the fact that he's got the head on means that John has free reign to indulge all his kind of fantasies about the creative life. So he thinks maybe he wears the head because he had some really dreadful, he's traumatized from some awful childhood, which makes John think, if only I hadn't had this like really nice middle class upbringing, I too could be a genius. The theory of suffering equals art kind of is what John can't face, is that he's just not very good at writing songs. He thinks there's got to be a secret to this. If I could just crack it, and what you learn in the film is that it's not so simple. It's not such a romantic. There's not, that romanticization of creativity is like doesn't bear much scrutiny.
Is there anything that's different in your approach to, I mean, maybe even just visually, filming John versus filming Frank to make them both seem like real people despite what they're dealing with?
Well, there are a few, I mean, generally what I thought was really interesting about this for me as a filmmaker was, I mean, there's like, say you know, the usual language of making a scene, you know, you can shoot somebody wide, you can shoot like the whole place, you can go in and shoot a close-up, and when you go in for a close-up on somebody, you're kind of, you're doing two things, right? On the one hand, you're going because you want to see, it's like sort of the filmmaker going, I want to, something happening here, and I want to just go in a little bit and see what it is. Now, obviously, when you do that with Frank, you go and you find exactly the same face, only bigger, you know? Nothing, it's not like you're going to learn something. But what I discovered is, well, of course, there's also just the pure grammar of film. You know, going in for a close-up also tells you to think about that character. And that grammar still applies. So, amazingly enough, Frank shoots quite like just anybody else. With some, you're always sensitive to it, and there are some really, you can also play with the fact that you really don't know what it is that he's thinking. But you can also kind of tell the audience what he's thinking by how you shoot him, by when you choose to go to him. If you cut to a close-up on Frank after a particular line, you know that that line meant something to Frank, and it's sort of funny how that operates. He's bigger, the head is bigger, so we would either, you know, we'd usually be either further back or on a wider lens, just to sort of somehow match the, you know, it's like you're filming somebody with an enormous head, and sometimes you want it to feel that way, and sometimes you want it to sort of balance with the other one in the frame. It does lead to a certain complication, all right.
How much did all of this come into play in designing the head? Like, could you not go to a certain dimension because you knew it wasn't going to fit in like any frame?
Well, I think, you know, if you're thinking about, like, if you went for an enormous head, then it would be very hard to have a two-shot of Frank with somebody else.
I feel like Frank needs a family movie now.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You meet the parents.
Yeah,
right. So we made quite a lot of prototypes. It was the expression that was the hard thing to get right, because it has to be, we wanted something open and kind of just, what ended up working is just a sort of tiny hint of surprise, and that, it's something that could take on a kind of, it could be poignant and could be funny, and we had a sort of 3 or 4 really kind of real contenders. And the one that I thought was really going to work, it was only when we shot tests that it just didn't. And this other one, which I wasn't really favouring, just seemed to really work on screen, and that's the one that we chose.
What was wrong with the one that didn't work?
It was more lifelike, it was more sculpted. So it was shaped more like a face. So it was like, whereas Frank's head does, you know, there's a parting and there's a sort of, you know, there is relief and the nose comes out and the lips do a little and there are ears and things, but it's actually pretty much a round ball. So the less realistic one, the more puppet-like one somehow is more expressive. It's a bit like, you know, think about, you know, simple stick animation and how kind of moving it can be. If you like have a stick figure standing on its own, kind of looking off and down to one side, and the music is right, you start, you know, you feel empathy towards these little bits of lines on a piece of paper. So we are really good, humans are really good at reading gesture and expression from the tiniest clues. So what we needed to really give the audience was something that they could project onto, something itself that wasn't too real, something which is kind of open enough. It's hard to describe it. In fact, these things are really hard to describe. What we had to do is just make them and see what they did on screen.
How about in terms of directing your other actors? Were they able to have the same kind of feeling happen with Frank? Because, I mean, you get so much from looking at another actor's face, and then they don't have access to that.
Well, you know, again, amazingly enough, Maggie says, and it works in the story of the film, Maggie said she found it quite hard to connect to Frank. But given that her character really, the whole point, the whole sort of inner dynamic of her character is to desperately want to connect with Frank. That created this sort of pathos, I think, in the film. It sort of plays more towards the end. But like, generally speaking, even in the room when you're doing it, you just accept that that's Frank. You kind of, you know, and again, like Michael, there's a bit where they've just sort of said goodbye to Dawn in the desert, you know, and Michael stands there just holding this sort of what he thought were his ashes, and kind of just looks down, and it got a huge laugh in the screening last night because you sort of felt Frank's sadness in a much sweeter way than you would if it was the actor, you know, looking down. That's just a sad person. This Frank looking down is like every sad person ever, you know.